So just on behalf of UJA-JCC Greenwich, I am so excited to welcome you to a morning with Ariel Berger. I should say an encore morning because he's been to Greenwich and Stamford before. And a big thank you to our partners today who are United Jewish Federation of Greater Stamford, Bicultural Hebrew Academy, and the Parat Library. And it is always best when we work together, especially in a time where everything is virtual, because we can reach more people and more communities and more teachers and more students. A warm welcome to the students from Bicultural Hebrew Academy. And I'm going to turn it over to Kathy McCormick, who is the president of the board of directors of the Parat Library here in Greenwich.
Okay, good morning. As Pam said, I'm Kathy McCormick, board president of Parat Memorial Library in Old Greenwich, Connecticut. It's an honor to be supporting this timely program with Ariel Berger on his award-winning book, Witness, Lessons from Elie Wiesel's Classroom. If you've not had a chance to read his book, copies are available for checkout and contactless pickup at paratlibrary.org. Berger is a writer, teacher, and authority on spirituality, social change, and the arts. He is the founding director of the Witness Institute, whose mission is to empower emerging leaders inspired by the life and legacy of Elie Wiesel. An Orthodox-trained rabbi, Ariel received his PhD in Jewish Studies and Conflict Resolution under Professor Wiesel. Ariel Berger met Elie Wiesel at age 15 after a lecture at the 92nd Street Y and became his lifelong student, serving as his teaching fellow from 2003 to 2008. In his attempt to make sense of the complex world, Ariel Berger sought Wiesel's counsel on matters of spirituality, intellect, and faith. In his own words, Berger said, "I questioned everything in search of an answer, but it wasn't until I met Professor Wiesel that I realized that questioning is the answer." Please join me in welcoming Ariel Berger. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Ariel, before you speak, I'm going to take the host prerogative. I was simply waiting for someone to sign in. I wanted to also express deep gratitude to Lois and Bruce Zenkel, who made today's program possible and all of the programs that we're doing this year on anti-Semitism possible. And so I know that a little bit of gratitude would be an okay thing to interrupt the program for, so thank you.
It was hardly an interruption, and gratitude is always essential, especially today. I'm grateful too. I'm grateful to be with all of you. And I'm always grateful to speak about my teacher, Elie Wiesel, and the lessons that he left for us today. We're living through a very complex time, and we're dealing with questions that we haven't faced before, and we're dealing with questions that we have faced before, questions that we thought had been put to rest a long time ago, questions about hatred and indifference and polarization. And these are timeless and timely questions. And so I think a lot about what Professor Wiesel would say today. And the truth is, I don't know for sure what he would say today because he often surprised us. He often had a perspective that was astonishing and profound. And because of who he was, his own background, deeply rooted in Jewish tradition and Jewish study, his worldliness, his creativity, and his deep sense of morality, he was astonishingly creative in responding to contemporary events. But what I can speak to is what he actually said, what he said to me in private conversation and what he said to us in the classroom, and what he said as a matter of public record. And as Kathy mentioned, I met Professor Wiesel when I was 15 years old, and I didn't realize at the time that this would change my life, that this would become an ongoing long-term relationship that would really shape my life and my sense of personal mission. When I met Professor Wiesel, as Kathy mentioned, it was at a lecture in New York, and there was a reception room. We were able to meet Professor Wiesel, the great man. He was 4 years after winning the Nobel Peace Prize, very well known. I had already read Night. I know some of you here are teaching or studying Night now or in close proximity to this event. And I had read Night soon before meeting him. And so I was quite intimidated. But I remember when it was time to meet him after the lecture, he held his hand out to me and he said his name as if I had no idea who he was, with tremendous modesty. And then he said, "Come and see me and bring a question." Now, it took me about 7 or 8 months to build up the, what some people call the holy chutzpah, to go see him, because I wasn't sure if he meant the invitation sincerely, but of course he did, as he often did with young people. He was very generous with young people. And so I went to see him, and I started asking him questions. And I had many, many questions about the relationship between traditional Jewish life and my interest in the arts. I went to a very religious Orthodox school, and we studied Talmud every day. And the Talmud has the larger text in the middle, the older text of the Mishnah and the Talmud itself, and then the commentaries on the sides of the page, and then the super commentaries in tiny letters on the sides, and then a white space, a margin. And I was the kid in school who was always doodling in the margins. Spaceships and astronauts and dragons and knights fighting the dragons. And I would get in trouble often for this. Some of my teachers in yeshiva would say, that's interesting, and just sort of move on. But there wasn't a vocabulary in that context for talking about art, and certainly not for talking about the relationship between creativity and the wildness that comes with creativity, and tradition and observance and living inside of a heritage. And those were some of the questions I asked him. I had other questions also, because my older sister is blind, and I had questions about inclusion. How do we create a world in which people are really welcome and included, no matter what, no matter who they are and what the differences or the challenges that they face are? And so I went to Professor Wiesel. I asked him many, many, many questions, and I noticed pretty quickly something very odd. I noticed that he wasn't answering any of my questions. And at first this troubled me, but then I realized two things. First, I realized this is a very Jewish move, to answer a question with another question, or to answer a question with a story. But second, and more important, I realized that his questions were better than my own. And every time I left his home or his office, where we met in New York, I felt a little more clear, a little more empowered, a little bit more ready to face the next step, the next moment, the next challenge, the next question. And I would learn over time that this was very typical of Elie Wiesel. He loved questions. He celebrated questions. And he believed deeply in questions. He said, answers can separate people, but questions bring us together. Answers can close the conversation, but questions open up new conversations. And he pointed out that in Hebrew, the word for question, she'elah, has the word God in the middle, Aleph and Lamed. In the middle, hiding in the word question, God is in the question. And in English, he would say there is quest in question. So he loved to celebrate questions. But there was one question I didn't ask him, because it felt too personal, too intrusive. Those of you who are reading Night, do you remember the last scene of the book? Not to give anything away to those of you who are in the middle, but the last scene ends in a very dark place, in a dark moment, and with a dark image, understandably so. And after the war, and after going through the experiences of the camps, it would be understandable that someone would completely give in to despair and give up hope. And yet the man that I was getting to know was a man of tremendous joy and curiosity and love of people and love of chocolate and love specifically of chocolate rugelach. And I wanted to ask him, how did you go from Night to who you are now? How did you become a person of such joy and life and love of life? How did you do that? Another way of asking the question is, what happened on the page after the last page of Night? Another way of asking the question is, how does anyone transform suffering into hope and suffering into joy? And I want to spend a little time here because I think this is one of the questions that we're facing today during this pandemic and with all the other challenges that we're facing. A lot of people are struggling with isolation, which exacerbates issues of depression and anxiety that have been with us already. We are dealing with an opioid epidemic, which is a failed response to anxiety and depression and other mental health issues. And one of the questions that we have to all ask ourselves is, how do we transform our own experience of suffering, whatever it is, into something useful, into something hopeful, into something life-affirming? And of course, we come from a tradition that emphasizes life. In the Bible, it says, V'chai bahem, you should live in them or through them or with them, with the commandments of the Torah. And of course, our favorite toast is not chin chin, which is a fun toast, but it's l'chaim. It's to life. We celebrate life. And that is, in fact, one of the underlying philosophical principles of Judaism, is the celebration of life and emphasizing the dignity of life and fighting for life. That's the beginning of our ethics in many ways. And so I wanted to ask Professor Wiesel this question, not only because I was curious about him and his life, but because I wanted to understand, how does anyone make such a move from suffering to hope? I didn't ask him the question because I was shy. I didn't want to intrude. But I waited a few years. When I was in his classroom at Boston University, several years later, a student asked my question. And I remember it was the last day of class, the last day of the semester. Professor Wiesel taught at Boston University for almost 40 years. He lived in New York. He flew to Boston every week to teach. And then he flew back, unless he was flying to Paris or Oslo or Jerusalem to speak to government ministers or prime ministers somewhere. He was very dedicated to his students. And on the last day of the semester, unlike all the other class meetings, he opened the floor for any questions about anything. And this was when a student asked my question. And I was very grateful that she did. She asked, Professor, how did you go from the end of night to being this person we see in front of us, this person of great joy and love of life? He said, if you ask me how I survived or why I survived, I cannot tell you. I have no idea. I wasn't stronger than anyone else. I was sickly. I didn't have any connections in the camp. There were no protectors. And at times I even had very little motivation to live. I can't explain how I survived. But if you're asking me, how did I keep my sanity and my hope alive after the war, that I can tell you. He said, it was learning that saved me. It was my love of learning that saved me. And he told us this story that on the day of liberation, this is the page after the last page of night, the members of the American military and the International Red Cross who gathered the children of the camps and were taking care of them, giving them medical attention and shipping them off over the next weeks to orphanages in France and Switzerland and elsewhere. But right after liberation, they gathered all the children, and they ranged from age 9 or so to 19. He said, they gathered us and they asked us, what can we give you? What can we get you to make your life a little bit better? Is there anything we can do for you? We can't imagine what you've been through. Is there anything we can give you? And Professor Wiesel told us, I remember a girl asked for chocolate because she thought she remembered what chocolate tasted like from before the war, but she wasn't sure. She wanted to check her memory of chocolate. And a little boy asked for a coat or a sweater because he had not been warm for 3 years. But Professor Wiesel said, I asked for the same volume of Talmud that I was studying before the war, the same volume of the Talmud, the great compendium of Jewish law and legend that I was studying before the war, so that I could continue my studies at the exact same line and the exact same word where they were interrupted by the Nazis. And that's what saved me, he said. My love of learning, my return to learning saved me. And he said, I believe it can save all of us. The key to turning suffering into hope is curiosity. It's learning. It's celebration of learning. It's the return to learning, no matter what is happening in the world. And so first of all, moments like this where you come together to learn are so essential right now. And bringing more people into that circle of learners is so essential. And those of you who are in school right now, the act of learning itself is an act of resistance. The act of learning itself is an act of hope. It's an investment in yourself and in the future. And it's something we need to raise up and deepen more and more. Professor Wiesel also told us, though, over time, that hope is a moral choice. It's not just a feeling. It's a moral choice. And I add to this that I believe that hope is the first moral choice, because it's the moral choice that allows you to continue to make moral choices. If you give up, if you give in to despair, if you throw up your hands and say, there's nothing I can do to make the world better or my own situation better, or the plight of an oppressed people better, then indeed you will not help. You will join the ranks of the indifferent who allow terrible things to happen in the world from a sense of laziness or apathy or numbness. And there are many of us who are tempted by that, and I understand it. There are times when we have to chill out. We have to take a break. There are times when we need to rest our minds. But as a general commitment, we have to return to hope, and we have to return to a sense of responsibility for the world we're in. And right now we're in a kind of pause between the world that was and the world that will be. And my hope for this moment is that we will not go back to the way things were. We will do better. We will take this time to examine our assumptions, the systems, and the human values and designs that got us to the world that we saw, a world that was suffering a lot. And so hope is the first moral value. It's the beginning of everything. Professor Wiesel taught us so much about hope, about education, and about the secret ingredient in education that leads to hope and moral transformation. But before I talk about that, I want to just set the stage a little bit more. So after a few years after meeting Professor Wiesel, I enrolled in Boston University to study with him. And I enrolled in his class. He was teaching a course that year on Jewish women's voices. It was about Jewish authors and the struggles for equality within Jewish tradition and traditional texts from the Bible on. Esther and Devorah and Bruria in the Talmud and the Maid of Ludimir in Hasidic tradition. That was the course. And I had one goal for the entire course. My goal for the course was to be completely ignored and unnoticed because I was very shy, and I was suddenly surrounded by 70 other students, many of whom were older than I was, from around the world. Professor Wiesel attracted students from around the world, many of whom had very, very challenging burdens that they carried from their own life experience. There were grandchildren of Holocaust survivors, not surprising that they would be drawn to Elie Wiesel, but there were also occasionally grandchildren of Nazi officers who came to Elie Wiesel and said, "What do I do with the legacy of my grandfather?" One student I knew well was the granddaughter of an SS officer, and she met Professor Wiesel at a conference in Germany, and she said, "What do I do? Do I have to change my name? Is there a way to redeem this terrible family legacy?" He said, "In my tradition, in the Jewish tradition, we do not believe in collective guilt. You carry this burden, your responsibility is to make it into a blessing somehow. And then he said, "Come and study with me." And she came to Boston and studied with him for several years, doing a master's degree, and studied, among other things, Jewish studies. So these students were coming with profound stories, sometimes traumatic experiences. And I was a young student from Queens, New York, and I wanted to be unnoticed for the semester. I sat in the corner very quietly, and I almost succeeded at my goal. But towards the end of the semester, Professor Wiesel asked a question of the class, and then he looked at me and he waited a very long time. And I had no choice but to respond. And I said the word that was in my mind, which was authenticity. That was my answer to his question, my response to his question, authenticity. He smiled and nodded and said, "Exactly." And a few weeks later, he asked me to become his teaching assistant the following year. So I always tell audiences, if you're ever looking for a job, or you're trying to fundraise, or you're trying to open a door, use the word authenticity. It's like a magic word. You can just say it out of context, and it'll open doors wherever you are. That's how it felt. It felt like a magic word. And I sat with his invitation, and I decided to decline Elie Wiesel's invitation to be his teaching assistant, because I was already planning on taking a year off to travel to Israel to study. And I really felt drawn to that. I needed to dive into Jewish study and Jewish tradition more. And it was a difficult decision. I wrote him a long letter explaining my decision, and then I called him at home. And he answered the phone, and I said, "Did you get my letter?" He said, "I did." I said, "And?" He said, "Well, you know how much I celebrate learning. You know how much I believe in learning. And so I applaud your desire to go and study. That's wonderful. Then he said something that again would change my life. He said, and I'll wait for you. When you're finished with your studies there, come back and be my teaching assistant then. I thought he was just being kind, but he really meant it. I ended up staying in Israel for 7 years, and I stayed in touch with Professor Wiesel. When I came back, I was looking at different job opportunities. I met with him for advice to ask him about those different career paths. He said, why are you looking at any of those things? I told you I'd wait for you. Come and be my teaching assistant now at Boston University. And I was shocked that he remembered that conversation. And I did. I went to study with him at Boston University. I spent the next 5 years working with him closely and watching as he transformed people's lives in the classroom. And the way he transformed people's lives in the classroom was through education. But it was through a particular kind of education, because we know, Professor Wiesel taught us, that it's possible to be highly educated and still participate in terrible things. We know that many of the Nazis were highly educated people. Many of the SS officers had PhDs. Doctors and lawyers were involved. All the mechanics and mechanisms of the state were involved in what the Nazis called euphemistically their final solution. And so education is not an immediate automatic inoculation against hatred, but Professor Wiesel taught a certain kind of education, a certain kind of moral education with a secret ingredient. And the secret ingredient in moral education, the kind of education that makes people into thoughtful, sensitive, responsible, compassionate people, what we might call mensches, the secret ingredient in that kind of education is memory, what Professor Wiesel called memory. And when he said the word memory, you heard the capital M. The capital M, it was a sacred word for him, as I believe it should be for us. What is memory? Memory is not only knowledge of the past, although knowledge of the past is an endangered thing right now. And some of you may have seen the recent claims conference survey that showed that 23% of millennials couldn't identify what the Holocaust was. 66% couldn't identify the word Auschwitz. There have been other similar studies over the last several years. And so the basic memory of the past is critically important to support and protect and reinforce and transmit. And of course, the Holocaust was the most well-documented event in human history. The Nazis documented everything, and yet we're seeing amnesia about it. So we need to fight for the memory of the past because it has so many lessons for the present. But memory means more than that. Memory for Elie Wiesel is the powerful, empathic encounter with stories that change you. When you hear a story that changes your life, that gives you goosebumps or chills, it changes your mind, it changes your heart, it changes your nervous system and your body so that you're a little bit less likely to walk past someone on the street who is hurting or homeless or hungry. You're a little more likely to do the right and difficult thing. And that kind of moral education is what Professor Wiesel's life was about. He often said, I'm a teacher. Everything I do is teaching. My writing, my activism, it's all teaching and it all comes from my teaching. And my goal in all of my teaching is to sensitize, to help people recognize their power to make change. And students would often ask Professor Wiesel, you know, we're not Nobel Prize winners. What can we do? We're just students. What can we do to make the world better? And he would say, look for the outstretched hand. Look for someone in your immediate vicinity who needs a little bit of help or who needs a smile. Your parents might need help around the kitchen. That's a moral choice. Am I going to do more dishes or not? There's someone who's isolated right now and lonely who needs a phone call, and it might be uncomfortable to pick up the phone and call. That's a moral choice. Those moral choices, those small choices make a radical difference in the world, and they add up. And they also train us to be more and more empowered to make the right decisions at larger and larger scales. Along the way, Professor Wiesel struggled out loud with us as his students about questions concerning faith and the role of God and the role of questions and doubt. And he developed an approach to questions of faith that was sophisticated and liberating, where he said that faith and doubt, faith and questions do not contradict. The opposite of faith is not doubt, it's indifference. If you're engaged in asking questions, you are engaged in a life of faith. And his own love of Jewish learning, he studied Talmud every day. And his love, particularly of the Hasidic tradition, the early teachings of the Hasidic masters from 200 years ago in Eastern Europe, and their stories, their mystical stories of friendship and solidarity and compassion, were a driving force in his life and in his work. But at the same time, of course, he was visiting the White House and talking to the president about foreign policy and genocide intervention. One of my hobbies in those years was to watch Professor Wiesel on the public stage whenever there was a talk or a news conference or something like that. And I would watch and I would pay attention and I would try to annotate or footnote in my mind and sometimes on paper all of the quotes from Jewish tradition that he was subtly bringing into the conversation. He was never quoting things explicitly, but if you paid attention and you knew some of those sources, you could track that he's drawing on a Hasidic tale or a Talmudic debate or a biblical story in his discussions about what's happening in Yugoslavia or Rwanda or Darfur. And this, for me and for many of us, was a model not only for how do we transform suffering into hope, but one of the most important things that we're struggling with today. How do we bridge the gap between our particular identities? In my case, my identity as a Jew and my universal human commitments. How do I recognize that those things are not in tension or conflict with one another, but in fact, my particular identity leads me to solidarity with others? And anyone who tells me that there's a choice between my personal, my particular, my tribal identity and universal commitments and universal alliances is giving me a false choice. Professor Wiesel taught us that that's a false choice, that the more connected you are to your tradition, the more it should lead you to universal commitments. And so the way in which he turned suffering into hope, and the way in which he turned particular Jewish teachings into sources for wisdom about current events and how to help people on the other side of the world are two of the important lessons that he left for us today. And one final one before we open to your questions. He told us, in no uncertain terms, that when we see signs of hatred, even if it's just in language, even if it's just in the form of gestures, we need to fight it. We need to name it and we need to fight it right away because hatred grows. And when we allow it to grow unchecked, it grows. But as we're fighting hatred, we need to make sure that we don't become defined only by that fight. We cannot become enemies of hatred who are filled with rage and forget to celebrate life and friendship and learning. He said, tragedy does not define us. It is our response to tragedy that defines us. And he often said, the enemy doesn't define us. We are children of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, and Leah. That's who we are. We have to remember who we are as we're fighting hatred and indifference. We have to remember our positive qualities and the gifts and the blessings that we hold for the world. That's our responsibility. And I think in this moment, these are some of the teachings that he left for us that are not answers. They are questions for us to consider. How do we turn suffering into hope for ourselves and others? How do we draw on our particular identities to bring blessing to the whole world? How do we fight evil and hatred and the forces that want to polarize us further without falling into the trap of shadowy rage and anger, and without falling into the trap of forgetting all that we have to celebrate? So thank you for listening. Let's open to your questions now.
Ariel Berger, thank you so much. It's always so hard to ask you questions when you're done. We have a lot of questions, and I don't know if you want them one at a time, two at a time. But there's one I want to begin with, which is, we may be talking to people who don't know a lot about the Holocaust, or who are just starting their education about the Holocaust, or teachers. So besides night, and not just Elie Wiesel, maybe. I don't know how you want to answer the question, but where is the best place to begin education about this? And combining with another question, which is limited to Elie Wiesel, if you were only going to recommend 2 or 3 of his books, which would they be?
If he were going to, or if I were going to?
You.
Okay. So the first question is very important. And I want to begin by saying that the Holocaust is not merely a subject. The Holocaust is not only a subject that some people might be interested in and others might not be interested in. The Holocaust is unique in human history, and the Holocaust is about the Holocaust, but the Holocaust is equally about everything else. The Holocaust still defines our reality today, not only for the Jewish people, not only because we lost 2/3 of our people and have to understand what it means to live in a Jewish world without some of our greatest teachers and their children and descendants. As Elie Wiesel often said, the Holocaust deprived us of many future scientists, doctors, Nobel Prize winners, maybe someone who would have found a cure for cancer. And we don't know what we lost. But beyond that, the Holocaust is about the extremes of human behavior, what happens in situations of ultimate human moral choice. And how do we understand that in terms of all of world history and our contemporary situation? So the Holocaust is also about everything that goes into being a human being. And we need to understand that the question of how do we approach the Holocaust is the question of how do we approach understanding about human behavior. And the answer to the question of where to begin differs for different people, different learners, different styles of learning, but I can point you to 2 really important and very accessible resources. One is the organization Facing History and Ourselves, which is a wonderful organization that you can look up online and has a lot of really, really wonderful resources, digital resources and print resources, as well as teachers' workshops. And they begin with Holocaust and human behavior, again, because they're putting the Holocaust in that context of universal questions. So that's number one. And the second is the great historian Lucy Davidowitz, one of the most important historians of the Holocaust, who wrote many books that are very important. One is called The War Against the Jews, which I highly recommend. So it's very possible now to begin to engage with this. But if you're just starting out, really the first thing I would read is Night by Elie Wiesel, because it's one person's story and it puts a face on it and it raises many, many questions that create thirst and curiosity for more. That's one of the reasons that Night is taught in so many schools. It's a great, great starting point. People also often read The Diary of Anne Frank, which captures an important aspect of the Holocaust. It's important to mention that The Diary of Anne Frank, though, ends before the camps. So we don't know. We have an eyewitness testimony about Anne Frank in Bergen-Belsen, I believe, but we don't have a lot of information about what happened in the most extreme aspects of the Holocaust. But those are the books that are generally taught in schools for a reason. In terms of Professor Wiesel's own books, he often said that without Night, there would have been no other books. So Night is essential. Night is almost a biblical book. And for years, I've taught Night together with a good friend of mine who's a classics professor to teachers who are teaching Night. And my friend, Professor Stephen Esposito at Boston University, teaches Night as an example of a Greek tragedy, and also as distinct from Greek tragedy in certain ways. And I teach Night as a biblical text, as if it were a biblical text. So Night, number one. But the first thing I always tell teachers is you need to know before we begin that Elie Wiesel was a very joyful person who loved to tell jokes and loved life and was curious about learning. You need to know that before you go in. And so the second book I would recommend, and this is a bit of a personal bias, but you asked a subjective question. Souls on Fire by Elie Wiesel is my favorite book by Professor Wiesel. It's a book of tales of the Hasidic masters. It was published in 1972, I believe, and it changed my life when I was a young man. It introduced me to a whole aspect of the Jewish world that I had had no exposure to. And it feels, when you're reading the book, it feels like there are two things happening. One is a very intellectually stimulating series of tales and histories, but also it feels like you're sitting around a table with a warm bowl of soup listening to a grandfather, an old storyteller, tell you the stories. And that's because Professor Wiesel is drawing on his own grandfather and his storytelling. And so it's a way of plugging into a tradition that celebrates life and celebrates friendship and has tremendous relevance to our psychological realities today. There's a lot there about joy and the struggle for joy in the face of suffering and other issues that are very, very modern. So those are my two go-to books.
You know, somebody commented in direct message that if history, quoting Rudyard Kipling, that if history were told in the form of stories, it would never be forgotten. So I think you're right. We literally have two questions, and then we'll end. I know there are a lot more. The first is that you said that Elie Wiesel said that the past has lessons for the present. And so what do you think he would tell us about the rise of anti-Semitism in America and the world today? What should we be worried? Should we be doing something about it? And how do you think, and this is, something you have to imagine, how do you think he would respond to the fact that Mein Kampf and the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, are freely sold on the internet, while books that challenge progressive ideas or even this whole Dr. Seuss pulling are being pulled by booksellers? What do you think he would say about these two things?
Well, these things are certainly related. The rise of anti-Semitism and the presence of books like Mein Kampf on Amazon or other public, easily available stores, online stores, are deeply related. And we're one of the things that we've been saying over the last several years is a challenge to the notion that was spoken often and publicly by Jewish leaders that somehow the American Jewish experience is fundamentally and qualitatively different than the rest of Jewish history. There were Jewish leaders who wrote books about this, that anti-Semitism is over. It doesn't define Jewish life anymore. And as if the American Jewish experience is an island in the river of Jewish history, and we are free of the waves and the storms of Jew hatred. And of course, that turns out not to be true. And one of the things we know is that anti-Semitism is perhaps the oldest hatred. It's also a hatred that takes many, many forms. There was pagan anti-Semitism, early Christian anti-Semitism, medieval, modern, Western, Eastern, fascist, communist anti-Semitism. The only thing that the fascists and communists had in common was hatred of the Jews. And very often the conversation is about anti-Semitism as a defining feature of Jewish life. Professor Wiesel rejected that. He took a more mystical view. He said, anti-Semitism doesn't really make any sense. If you look at historical dynamics, it doesn't really usually take place that a certain form of hatred appears in so many different guises for so many different reasons that are contradictory. They hate Jews for being rich, they hate Jews for being poor, they hate Jews for being urban or for being too much in the rural areas. And if you look into it, you see that this is very much the case with anti-Semitism. It's very irrational. But he also said there's one other historical phenomenon that's completely irrational and makes no sense, and that is the survival of the Jewish people. We are the only people of antiquity to have survived antiquity. There's no other story like this. All the empires that existed from antiquity are gone. There are no Akkadians anymore. There are no Sumerians. They left some literature and some documents, the Code of Hammurabi and Gilgamesh and other things, but there's no civilization. And there's no Egyptian civilization. Egyptians today are not the Egyptians of antiquity. And yet the Jewish people are here, having survived without a homeland or a government or autonomy for 3,000 years, without even a shared language. It doesn't make any sense. So Professor Wiesel would look at anti-Semitism as the shadow of Jewish eternity. And he would say, these are both irrational, and they point to some kind of meaning beyond the normal laws of history. But we have to fight anti-Semitism. And we have to fight anti-Semitism for three reasons. Number one, we have to look out for ourselves, right? The Jewish community, we have to take care of our own needs. We have to make sure we stand up against anti-Semitism to protect our own people. That's obvious. That's number one. Number two, also obvious, anti-Semitism, like any other form of hatred, racism, or oppression, is evil. And anyone of goodwill, any person of goodwill needs to fight it. But number three is where it gets interesting. Professor Wiesel often pointed out that whatever happens to the Jewish people ultimately happens to the world. There's a pattern here. Anti-Semitism is a harbinger of what's going to happen to everyone else. So Auschwitz was a precursor to Hiroshima. And suicide terrorism began in Israel, but migrated to New York in 9/11. He would point out those patterns. And he believed that somehow the Jews and the Jewish experience serves as a bellwether, a canary in the coal mine, and anti-Semitism becomes a sign of what's coming. And so we have to, and we know for a fact that white supremacist groups, for example, have many different platforms. They all share a fierce commitment to anti-Semitism. There's more diversity in their approaches to racism than there is to their hatred of Jews, interestingly. And you can look into this in FBI reports and so on. And I've heard this from former white supremacists directly. So somehow anti-Semitism is the common denominator in a lot of those hate groups. So when we see it, we have to call it out. When we see Mein Kampf being sold, or the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, that nefarious forgery, we have to call it out. And we have to recognize that anti-Semitism still has a pull, a kind of hypnotic pull on many people in subtle ways and less subtle ways. And it can infect conversations about the Middle East and about other things in ways that really are dangerous. And even though it's just language, language leads to action, language leads to policy. So we have to be very careful and aggressive and precise in naming these things. The precision works in two directions. We have to make sure to call out anti-Semitism when it's there, and we have to make sure that we don't mistake legitimate criticism from a place of love and constructive feedback for anti-Semitism. That can happen too. But both things are true. And very often in the Jewish community, people call out one side of that equation and not the other, just as they call out anti-Semitism on the right or on the left. And one of the things that Professor Wiesel was very clear about is that we find anti-Semitism on the far right and the far left, and we don't have to choose. We have the whole menu before us. We can fight anti-Semitism on both fronts, and we need to fight it on both fronts. And the way we fight it is directly by calling it out, but also by celebrating all the gifts that we bring to the world as Jews, and by making friendships and connections across communities, so that every conversation about anti-Semitism includes conversations about racism and vice versa. And this is a place where we still have a lot of work to do, because we're living in an era when people are choosing which issue and which form of suffering am I going to privilege, am I going to focus on at the expense of others. And this is one way that enemies try to divide people who are fighting against oppression. Pick your issue, ignore everyone else's, or ignore your own people and become an activist on behalf of everyone else. Professor Wiesel's message was very clear. You have to stand up for your own people and for everyone else. It's difficult, it's more work, that's why we're here. It's difficult, so what? He would often say that, it's difficult, so what? So do the difficult thing. You need joy to do it, so cultivate your joy so you have the energy to do it.
Such a great message. I desperately want to end on that note, but there was a question that will circle back to you and Elie Wiesel, and I think we should ask it, and maybe it'll help us end on a positive note. What did Elie Wiesel say, if anything, about the practice of creativity? The whole Chaim Potok, Asher Lev kind of a thing. I know that you yourself are an artist. And is there a role for creativity in answering some of these questions you're talking about?
Yes, this is great. This brings me back to the beginning when I was 15, 16, 17. Those were my questions. So we talked about this a lot. We talked about creativity a lot. And My Name is Asher Lev and The Gift of Asher Lev were two of my favorite books when I was a teenager, because I felt like Asher Lev. I was an artist in a very religious environment. So a few things to say about this quickly. One, when I was writing the book, Witness, I started writing the book because I said to Professor Wiesel, Professor, a lot of people don't even know that you're a teacher. And so someone needs to write a book about your classroom. And he said, you're right. You need to write a book about my classroom. And I was not expecting that answer. So it took a while for me to do it, but eventually I wrote the book for that reason. And as I was writing it, midway through, I realized I have to add a chapter. I got to share the chapter, the table of contents with Professor Wiesel before he passed away, but most of the book was written after he passed away, right after he passed away, the year after. And when I was halfway through that process, I realized I need to add a chapter about the arts because it was such an essential part of Professor Wiesel's life. First, because he's a writer. And so as a writer, he's constantly engaged in creative work, especially in his fiction, but also in his nonfiction books. And in France, they know Elie Wiesel primarily as an artist, as an artistic figure, as a literary figure, and afterwards as the witness to the Holocaust and human rights activist and so on. But also because, as will become clear when you read his writings, there's so much that cannot be conveyed in words. There's so much that we experience that can't really be captured in words. And there's so many moments when we experience the limits of language. And Professor Wiesel, whose life was about conveying the experience of the Holocaust, which was unimaginable, ineffable, impossible to articulate fully, tried to find words to tell that story, but knew that ultimately it was impossible. And he did his best, but towards the end of his life, even at the end of his life, he said, I don't know if I found the right words. Because the truth is, if we had found the right word, there would never have been another genocide. So it must be that we didn't find the right words in Night and in other books and all the other memoirs of survivors. And yet you have to tell the story. How could we not tell the story? So there are ways that he had to transcend language. And he did that in several ways. One was in writing Night itself. And those of you who are reading Night, this is very important to know. And you may know already that he wrote a book that was 867 pages long. And then he cut it down to the book that we know as Night, which is 112 or 113 pages long. He wrote the book through a process of subtraction. And he did it very deliberately because it was the only way he felt he could convey the story, by erasing, by removing, so that we would feel the absence of the presence of the words that had been there before, so that we could have a sense of the absence of all the souls, all the people who were lost to us. He found ways of going beyond words, even in his writing. And the white space on the page is very, very important there. But also there were moments in the classroom when he ran out of words. He just couldn't convey what he was trying to convey in words. And I think 4 times when I was there with him, I was there for a total of 6 years, 5 as TA and 1 year as a student. There were 4 times that he stopped speaking and he sang. He sang melodies of his childhood to the students. And I asked him once, why did you sing today? And he said, I was trying to convey something so profound, and I was sensing that I could not convey it in words. So I went beyond words and I sang. And I just want to end by saying that in a moment when we are dealing with a lot of polarization and a lot of difficulty around a lot of issues in our Jewish communities, in our families sometimes, and beyond, between communities, we engage with words. We talk about policy. We disagree about policy and policy decisions. And of course, policy is critically important. We have to figure out those policy questions. We have to argue and disagree, and we have to do it well in words. But there are moments when we have to remember who we are and how connected we are to one another. And there are moments when instead of speaking, instead of arguing, we have to sing together. As the great Rabbi Nachman of Breslov said, the great Hasidic master said, when 2 people speak at the same time, it's cacophony. When 2 people sing at the same time, we call that harmony. When it's done right, we call that harmony. So we have to look for opportunities to sing together, and that's something Professor Wiesel really celebrated. And it gave him a lot of strength to do everything that he did.
Thank you so much. I also just want to thank Lois and Bruce Ankel again for making it possible for the community to sing together with you today. The Parat Library, Bicultural Hebrew Academy, United Jewish Federation of Greater Stamford, and Bicultural Hebrew Academy. And you see, Ariel, you brought us together to do that. So thank you. And I hope we hear more from you.
Thank you all
Thanks
so
so
much.
much.
Stay very well. Thank you, Pam. Bye-bye, everyone.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support JBS with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double high or more. Simply visit the JBS website at jbstv.org and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check to JBS, Post Office Box 360, Stamford, Connecticut 06904. Or you can call the JBS Pledge Line at 833-MY-JBS-TV. That's 833-695-2788. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive with our compliments. We thank you for your kind support.